What if I told you that 5 simple words changed the course of an entire kingdom forever? You're about to witness one of the most shocking power reversals in history. A story so unbelievable that if it were fiction, you'd call it unrealistic. But this actually happened. Picture this. You're standing in the grand throne room of a medieval castle. The air is thick with tension. Hundreds of nobles, knights, and servants have gathered to witness what they believe will be nothing more than entertainment. The king sits on his golden throne, his crown catching the light from massive chandeliers above. He's laughing, actually laughing. But the person standing before him, they're trembling. Meet Elias, 22 years old, thin as a reed, clothes that have seen better days, much better days. His hands shake as he clutches a worn leather satchel. Everyone in that room sees the same thing, a nobody. A peasant who somehow managed to stumble into the presence of royalty. King Aldric leans forward, his massive frame dwarfing the ornate throne. Gold rings glint on every finger. His voice booms across the marble floors. "I'll give you my crown if you can beat me." The entire court erupts in laughter. Nobles elbow each other, whispering jokes. Guards smirk behind their helmets. Even the servants can barely contain their amusement. You see, King Aldric wasn't just any king. He was known throughout the 7 kingdoms as the Undefeated. In 43 years of life, he had never lost. Not at war. Not at politics. Not at anything that mattered. His kingdom was the richest, his army the strongest, his treasury the fullest. And here stood Elias, a young man who looked like he hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. But here's what nobody in that room knew. Not the laughing nobles, not the sneering guards, not even the king himself. They were all about to witness something that will be talked about for generations. Elias wasn't just any peasant. You might be wondering, what could this trembling young man possibly possess that would threaten a king who had everything? What was in that worn leather satchel he clutched so desperately? The answer will blow your mind. But first, let me tell you how he got here. How a nobody from nowhere ended up standing before the most powerful man in the kingdom, about to change everything. 3 days earlier, Elias had been nothing. Less than nothing. He worked in the castle stables, mucking out stalls for copper coins that barely bought him bread. The other stable hands mocked him. The kitchen maids ignored him. Even the castle dogs seemed to look down on him. But Elias had a secret. Every night, after the castle fell quiet, he would sneak into the old tower library, a place so forgotten that dust layered the floor like snow. There, surrounded by ancient books and scrolls that hadn't been touched in decades, Elias would study. What was he studying? That's the question that haunted everyone who would later try to piece together this incredible story. Some say he was learning forbidden magic. Others whispered about ancient mathematical formulas. The truth? It was something far more powerful than either. You see, while King Aldric ruled through fear and gold, while his nobles schemed for favor and position, while his armies conquered through strength, Elias was mastering something they had all forgotten. Something that no crown could buy, no sword could defeat, no army could overcome. And now, standing in that throne room with hundreds of eyes mocking him, Elias was about to prove that true power doesn't always wear a crown. King Aldric's challenge echoed off the marble walls. "I'll give you my crown if you can beat me." The king expected Elias to stammer, to apologize, to back down like everyone else always did. After all, who would dare challenge the Undefeated? But instead of cowering, something incredible happened. Elias straightened his shoulders. The trembling stopped. He looked directly into the king's eyes, something no peasant had ever dared to do, and spoke words that sent a chill through the entire room. "Your Majesty, I accept your challenge." The laughter died instantly. You could have heard a pin drop in that massive throne room. Nobles exchanged worried glances. Guards shifted nervously. The king's smile faltered for just a moment, the first crack in his armor of absolute confidence. Because in that instant, everyone realized something had just changed. This wasn't going to be the entertainment they expected. This was going to be something else entirely. But what happens next will shock you even more than what you've already heard. Because what King Aldric proposed as a challenge, what he was so certain he would win, was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. Now, to understand just how impossible the situation was, you need to know exactly what kind of world Elias had just challenged. The kingdom of Aldris wasn't just any medieval kingdom. This was a place where power meant everything, and King Aldric had built his entire identity around being untouchable. Picture the most arrogant person you've ever met. Now multiply that by 1,000 and give them absolute power over millions of lives. That was King Aldric. He didn't just rule, he dominated. Every morning, he would hold court where nobles would literally compete to see who could praise him most creatively. Lords would travel hundreds of miles just to kiss his ring. Queens from neighboring kingdoms sent their daughters hoping to win his favor. And the challenges? Oh, King Aldric loved his challenges. You see, this wasn't the first time someone had stood before that throne. The king had a twisted hobby of humiliating anyone who dared approach him. He would issue impossible challenges, always with the same mocking promise. Beat me, and you can have whatever you desire. A blacksmith once challenged him to a contest of strength. The king crushed him so thoroughly that the man never lifted a hammer again. A scholar challenged him to a battle of wits. King Aldric destroyed him with riddles so complex that the scholar left the kingdom in shame. A merchant challenged him to a game of strategy. The king bankrupted him in minutes. Every single challenge ended the same way, with King Aldric laughing and his victim crawling away in humiliation. The court loved it. It was better than any theater performance. But here's what made King Aldric truly dangerous. He wasn't just cruel, he was brilliant. The man had intelligence that was genuinely terrifying. He could solve mathematical problems that stumped his advisors. He spoke 7 languages fluently. He could predict military strategies 3 moves ahead. His memory was so perfect that he could recite conversations from years ago word for word. And he used every bit of that intelligence to crush anyone who dared challenge his authority. So when Elias accepted the challenge, everyone in that room knew they were about to witness another destruction. Another peasant about to be ground into dust for their entertainment. But then King Aldric did something that changed everything. Instead of announcing a contest of strength or wit or strategy like he usually did, the king leaned back in his throne with a smile that was pure predator. "Very well, stable boy," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Since you're so eager to embarrass yourself, let me choose something appropriate for your station." The king gestured to a massive chessboard that his servants quickly brought forward. But this wasn't just any chess set. The pieces were carved from pure gold and silver, each one worth more than Elias would earn in 10 lifetimes. "Chess," King Aldric announced. "The game of kings. The ultimate test of intelligence and strategy." The court gasped. Even by King Aldric's standards, this was brutal. You have to understand, chess in this kingdom wasn't just a game. It was the mark of education, of nobility, of breeding. Peasants didn't play chess. They weren't allowed to play chess. The very idea was laughable. Chess required years of study. Masters devoted their entire lives to understanding its complexities. Kings employed chess tutors from foreign lands just to improve their skills. And King Aldric? He was considered one of the greatest chess players who had ever lived. He had defeated grandmasters from across the known world. His chess strategies were studied in universities. Books had been written about his famous games. The man had literally never lost a single match. Standing there in his patched clothes, with his worn leather satchel, Elias looked like he probably didn't even know how the pieces moved. "One game," King Aldric continued, clearly savoring every word. "You get white the advantage of the first move. I'll even give you time to think about each move while I play quickly." The king was practically purring with satisfaction. "When I win, and I will win, you'll spend a month in the dungeons for wasting my time. But if by some miracle you beat me," he touched his golden crown with one jeweled finger, "this becomes yours, along with my kingdom, my treasury, my armies, everything." The silence in that throne room was deafening, because everyone suddenly realized that King Aldric had just made the ultimate bet. He was so confident, so absolutely certain of victory, that he was willing to stake everything on a single chess game. His crown, his kingdom, his legacy, all against a stable boy who looked like he'd never seen a chess piece in his life. The nobles were torn between excitement and terror. If the king lost, which was impossible, but still, they would all be serving a peasant by sunset. But that wasn't going to happen. It couldn't happen. Could it? Elias stepped forward to the chessboard. His hands were steady now. That strange confidence from earlier was growing stronger. And as he looked down at those golden chess pieces, something flickered in his eyes. something that made a few of the sharper observers in the court feel the first tiny whisper of doubt. But what they were about to witness would shatter everything they thought they knew about power, intelligence, and the true nature of strength. What happened next was exactly what everyone expected, and somehow even worse. Elias approached the golden chessboard like he was walking to his own execution. The massive pieces gleamed under the chandelier light, each one a work of art that cost more than most people's homes. King Aldric settled into his ornate chair across from the board, completely relaxed. He didn't even bother sitting up straight. This was going to be over so quickly that proper posture seemed unnecessary. "White moves first," the king said with an amused smile. "Go ahead, stable boy. Show us what you've learned in those prestigious stables." The court tittered with laughter. Elias reached for the white pieces with a trembling hand, and immediately everyone knew their suspicions were correct. He picked up a pawn, put it down, picked up a knight, put it down. His fingers hovered over different pieces like he was trying to remember which one did what. The snickering from the nobles grew louder. Having trouble deciding, King Aldric asked mockingly, "Perhaps you need a lesson on how the pieces move? I'm sure one of my pages could teach you the basics." The humiliation was already beginning, and the game hadn't even started. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of fumbling, Elias moved a pawn forward. Not just any pawn, he moved it to one of the worst possible squares. A move so bad that even the servants watching from the back of the room winced. King Aldric's eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise. That's actually worse than I expected," he said, and the court erupted in laughter. The king responded instantly, moving his own pawn with the casual confidence of someone swatting a fly. The perfect counter that immediately put pressure on Elias's position. "Your move," King Aldric said, already looking bored. What followed was a masterclass in how to destroy someone's dignity piece by piece. Elias's second move was somehow even worse than his first. He moved his knight to a square where it could immediately be captured. Not just captured for free, with no benefit whatsoever. The nobles weren't even trying to hide their laughter anymore. Some were wiping tears from their eyes. Others were placing bets on how quickly this travesty would end. "5 moves," shouted Duke Mortimer from the crowd. "I say the stable boy loses in 5 moves. 3, called out Lady Evangeline. "He won't last 3. King Aldric captured the knight with theatrical flair, holding the golden piece up for everyone to see before setting it aside. "1 down, 15 to go," he announced to thunderous applause. But this was just the beginning of Elias's humiliation. His third move defied all logic. He moved his queen, the most powerful piece on the board, directly into harm's way. Not just into danger, but into a position where it could be taken by 3 different pieces. The gasps from the audience weren't mockery anymore. They were genuine shock at witnessing such spectacular incompetence. "Stop," said King Aldric, holding up his hand. The laughter died instantly. "I need to ask, have you ever actually played chess before? Because what you just did, that's not strategy. That's not even random. That's like you're actively trying to lose." Elias's face was burning red. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His hands shook as he reached for his pieces, only to pull back repeatedly like he couldn't decide what to do. I know how to play," he stammered, his voice barely audible over the whispers of the crowd. Clearly, King Aldric said dryly and took the queen. Just like that, Elias had lost his most powerful piece in 3 moves. The crowd was beside themselves. This wasn't just a defeat, it was a complete annihilation of everything chess was supposed to represent. Strategy, intelligence, forethought. Elias seemed to possess none of it. "Perhaps we should end this charade," suggested Lord Chancellor Blackwood from his position near the throne. "This is becoming painful to watch." But King Aldric was enjoying himself too much to stop. "No, no," he said, waving dismissively. The boy wanted a challenge. Let's give him the full experience. What happened over the next several moves was a systematic destruction of everything Elias had on the board. The king didn't just win pieces, he won them with style, with commentary, with little lessons for the court about proper strategy. "You see," King Aldric explained as he captured another piece, "when you move your bishop here, you're actually opening up your king to attack. Basic tactics, really." Elias lost his other knight. Then both his rooks. His bishops fell in rapid succession. Within 10 moves, he had almost nothing left while King Aldric's army remained virtually untouched. The stable boy sat slumped in his chair, staring at the board like he couldn't believe what was happening. His leather satchel lay forgotten at his feet. "This is actually sad," whispered Lady Cordelia to her companion. "Look at him. He really thought he had a chance." And that's when something strange happened. As Elias stared at the devastating position in front of him, as the court laughed and pointed and made jokes about his stupidity, as King Aldric prepared to deliver the final checkmate, Elias smiled. Not a grimace, not a nervous twitch, a real, genuine smile. It was such an unexpected expression that several people in the front row actually leaned forward to get a better look. Why would someone smile when they were being so thoroughly humiliated? But that smile was about to become the first crack in everyone's certainty about how this story would end. That smile haunted everyone who saw it. Because when someone is being destroyed in front of hundreds of people, when they're losing everything they have, when they're about to spend a month in a dungeon for their arrogance, they don't smile. Unless they know something nobody else knows. But let me take you inside Elias's mind in that moment, because what was happening there will change everything you think you know about this story. As the court laughed and King Aldric prepared for what everyone assumed would be the final moves, Elias wasn't thinking about the humiliation. He wasn't thinking about the dungeon waiting for him. He wasn't even thinking about the impossible position on the chessboard in front of him. He was thinking about his father. You see, there was something about Elias that nobody in that throne room knew. Something that explained the worn leather satchel, the nights in the forgotten library, the confidence that seemed to come from nowhere. Elias wasn't just any stable boy. His father had been Magnus the Wise, the greatest chess master who had ever lived. A man so brilliant that kings from distant lands would journey for months just to play a single game with him. A legend whose strategies were still studied decades after his death. But Magnus had made one crucial mistake. He had dared to criticize King Aldric's policies in public. One comment about the unfair taxation of peasants, and Magnus found himself stripped of his titles, his lands, his wealth. Everything. He died in poverty when Elias was just 12 years old. But before he died, Magnus had made his son a promise. One day, he whispered on his deathbed, "You'll have the chance to show them what real chess looks like. When that day comes, remember everything I taught you. Remember that the greatest victories come from the deepest patience." For 10 years, Elias had prepared for this moment. Every night in that dusty library, he wasn't just reading random books. He was studying his father's chess journals, analyzing games that had never been published, learning strategies that had died with Magnus the Wise. But more than that, he was learning something his father had mastered better than anyone, the art of deception. Magnus had taught him that the greatest chess players weren't just good at the game, they were good at making their opponents underestimate them, at appearing weak when they were strong, at looking defeated when victory was within reach. A king who thinks he's already won, Magnus had written in his private notes, stops paying attention to the board. So as Elias sat there, watching King Aldric bask in his apparent superiority, every terrible move had been deliberate. Every captured piece had been a sacrifice. Every moment of apparent confusion had been an act. He was playing the longest game of his life. But the risk was enormous. If he had miscalculated even slightly, if King Aldric was more observant than expected, if the position wasn't as recoverable as he hoped, then the humiliation would be real. The month in the dungeon would be real. The failure to avenge his father's memory would be real. The stakes had never been higher. King Aldric leaned forward, studying the board with the satisfied expression of a cat playing with a mouse. "I have to admit, stable boy, you provided more entertainment than I expected. Usually my opponents at least try to put up a fight." The court chuckled appreciatively. "Tell me," the king continued, "where exactly did you learn to play chess? Because whoever taught you clearly had a sense of humor." This was the moment Elias had been waiting for. The moment to plant the first seed of doubt in the king's mind. "My father taught me," he said quietly. "Your father?" King Aldric laughed. "What was he, the village fool?" "Magnus," Elias said simply. The name hit the throne room like a thunderbolt. You could actually see the color drain from King Aldric's face. Several nobles gasped audibly. Even the guards shifted uncomfortably. Because everyone in that room knew the name Magnus the Wise, the man who had humiliated visiting grandmasters, the strategist whose theories were still taught in the finest schools, the only person who had ever dared to challenge King Aldric's policies and lived to tell about it. Well, live for a while, anyway. Magnus is dead, King Aldric said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. Yes, Elias replied, that strange smile still playing at his lips. But everything he knew, he taught me. Suddenly, the king wasn't looking quite so relaxed. He glanced back at the board, studying it more carefully than he had been. Looking for tricks. Searching for traps. But the position still looked hopeless for Elias. He was still down massive material. His king was still exposed. Victory still seemed as impossible as it had moments before. Wasn't it? King Aldric made his next move, but there was hesitation now. Doubt. The casual confidence was cracking. And Elias? He reached for his next piece with steady hands, his smile growing just a fraction wider. You know, Your Majesty, he said conversationally, my father once told me something interesting about chess. What's that? The king asked despite himself. He said that sometimes the best way to win is to let your opponent think they're winning. But what Elias did next would prove that everything, absolutely everything, the court thought they knew about this game was wrong. What happened next sent a shockwave through the entire throne room. For the first time since the game began, Elias moved quickly. No hesitation. No fumbling. His hand shot out and moved a piece with the precision of a master craftsman. It was a move so brilliant, so unexpected, so perfectly calculated that several of the nobles actually stood up to get a better look at the board. King Aldric's confident smile vanished completely. The move didn't just attack. It created a web of threats so complex that even the experienced chess players in the court needed a moment to understand what they were seeing. Suddenly, pieces that had seemed worthless were working together. Attacks that had appeared impossible were materializing out of nowhere. What? King Aldric stared at the board, his mind racing to calculate all the new possibilities. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like everything might change. The whispers started immediately. Did you see that move? Where did that come from? Maybe he's not as hopeless as we thought. Even Lord Chancellor Blackwood, who had been ready to win the game minutes earlier, was now studying the position with intense concentration. But King Aldric was still King Aldric. After a long pause, he smiled coldly and made his response. A move that not only countered Elias's brilliant play, but turned it against him. What had looked like a devastating attack suddenly became a trap that Elias had walked directly into. Clever, the king said, his confidence returning. I see your father did teach you a few tricks. But tricks aren't enough when you're facing a true master. The hope that had flickered in the crowd died instantly. Because now Elias's position wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. That brilliant move, that moment of genius, had somehow made everything worse. He was not only down material, but his remaining pieces were now tangled up, unable to help each other. It was like watching someone climb out of a pit, only to fall into an even deeper one. The court's laughter resumed, but there was a nervous edge to it now. They had seen Elias's potential for just a moment, and it had unsettled them. Even in defeat, he had shown flashes of something dangerous. You almost had me worried there, King Aldric said mockingly. For a second, I thought Magnus might have actually taught you something useful. But apparently even legends can fail as teachers. That jab at his father's memory hit Elias visibly. His hands clenched into fists. His jaw tightened. For the first time, real anger flashed in his eyes. And that's when things got worse. Because anger, as any chess player will tell you, is the enemy of good decisions. Elias's next move was driven by emotion instead of logic. He attacked aggressively, desperately, trying to create complications that might salvage his hopeless position. But desperate moves against a master like King Aldric were suicide. The king punished him ruthlessly. Within 3 moves, Elias had lost what little he had left. His bishop fell. His remaining knight was trapped. His pawns became nothing more than obstacles in his own way. This is painful to watch, Lady Evangeline whispered to Duke Mortimer. The boy clearly has some talent, but talent without discipline is worthless. His father would be ashamed, Duke Mortimer replied loud enough for Elias to hear. That comment cut deeper than any chess move could have. King Aldric sensed the psychological victory and pressed his advantage. You know what the real tragedy is, he said conversationally as he captured another piece. Magnus the Wise was truly brilliant. His games were works of art. And here you are, his son, playing like an angry child having a tantrum. The words were designed to wound, and they succeeded. Elias's shoulders sagged. The fire in his eyes dimmed. He looked exactly like what everyone had thought he was from the beginning, a peasant who had gotten in over his head and was finally realizing the magnitude of his mistake. Perhaps, suggested Lord Chancellor Blackwood gently, it would be merciful to resign now. Spare yourself the final humiliation. Elias looked up at the sea of faces surrounding him. Nobles who had gone from mockery to brief surprise and back to pity. Guards who were already mentally preparing his dungeon cell. Servants who were shaking their heads at his foolishness. And King Aldric, sitting across from him with absolute triumph written across his features. "What do you say, stable boy?" the king asked. "Ready to admit that your betters know best?" This was the moment. The lowest point. The place where heroes either break or find something deeper than they knew they had. Elias reached for his king, the universal gesture of resignation in chess. His fingers touched the golden piece. The court held its breath. King Aldric leaned forward expectantly. And then Elias did something that no one, absolutely no one saw coming. Instead of tipping over his king in surrender, he moved it. Not just any move. A move so subtle, so quiet, so seemingly meaningless that half the court didn't even notice it had happened. But King Aldric noticed. And for the first time in the entire game, something flickered across the king's face that hadn't been there before. Fear. Because that tiny, insignificant move had just changed everything. That flicker of fear across King Aldric's face lasted exactly half a second. Then he looked closer at the board, analyzed Elias's move, and burst into the loudest, most genuinely amused laughter the court had heard all day. "That's it," he roared, slapping his knee. "That's your great strategy? Moving your king one square to the side?" The entire throne room erupted. This wasn't just laughter anymore. It was hysteria. Nobles were doubled over. Guards were wiping tears from their eyes. Even the usually stoic Lord Chancellor was shaking his head with a bemused smile. Because King Aldric was right. The move was meaningless. Worse than meaningless, it was the kind of move a child might make when they had no idea what else to do. I thought for a moment, the king continued between fits of laughter, that you might have seen some brilliant tactical shot I had missed. But no, you just moved your king sideways. For no reason whatsoever. Lady Cordelia, cover her face with her fan. This is beyond embarrassing. Someone should put the poor boy out of his misery. It's like watching someone drown in 3 inches of water, Duke Mortimer added. But King Aldric wasn't finished with his psychological torture. He had smelled blood in the water, and he was going to extract every ounce of suffering from this moment. "Tell me, stable boy," he said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Do you actually understand what's happening on this board? Because that move suggests you might be confused about the rules." The crowd's laughter grew even louder. Elias sat in silence, staring at the board. His face had gone completely pale. The confidence, the mysterious smile, the brief flash of brilliance, all of it had drained away, leaving behind exactly what everyone had expected to see from the beginning. A broken peasant who had vastly overestimated himself. Perhaps, King Aldric continued, we should review the position for our audience. Ladies and gentlemen, behold the strategic genius of Magnus the Wise's son. The king began pointing to pieces on the board with theatrical flair. Here we have my queen, controlling the entire center of the board. There we have my rooks, doubled on the 7th rank, ready to deliver mate in the next few moves. And over here, he gestured dismissively at Elias's remaining pieces. We have, well, practically nothing. The itemization of Elias's failures was devastating. Every piece he had lost. Every opportunity he had squandered. Every mistake that had led him to this moment of complete helplessness. In fact, King Aldric announced with obvious relish, I commit you in exactly 4 moves. Would you like me to show everyone how? This was the ultimate humiliation. Not just losing, but having your defeat mapped out move by move while hundreds of people watched. Having your incompetence dissected like a specimen in a laboratory. Move 1, the king said, sliding his queen across the board with a flourish. Check. Elias was forced to move his king, the only legal response. Move 2. Another queen move. Check again. Elias moved his king to the only available square. Move 3. King Aldric's rook joined the attack. And now your king has nowhere to run. The position was indeed hopeless. Elias's king was trapped, surrounded by enemy pieces, with no escape possible. And move 4. King Aldric reached for his queen to deliver to the final checkmate. But then he paused. Not because he was being merciful. Not because he wanted to savor the moment. He paused because something on the board had caught his attention. Something that didn't make sense. The king's eyes narrowed as he studied the position more carefully. He looked at Elias's remaining pieces. He traced the lines of attack. He counted moves and possibilities. And slowly, very slowly, his confident smile began to fade. "What?" he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. The court sensed the change immediately. The laughter died away. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. All eyes fixed on King Aldric's face as confusion replaced certainty. "Your Majesty?" Lord Chancellor Blackwood asked carefully. "Is something wrong?" King Aldric didn't answer. He was too busy staring at the board with growing alarm. Because he had just noticed something that changed everything. That meaningless king move, the one that had provoked such laughter, such ridicule, such complete dismissal, wasn't meaningless at all. It had moved Elias's king to a very specific square. A square that seemed unimportant unless you looked 17 moves ahead and understood a chess concept so advanced that most masters never encountered it in their entire careers. "No," King Aldric breathed, his face going white. "No, that's not possible." But it was possible. And suddenly, everyone in that throne room was about to discover that they had been watching an entirely different game than they thought. The stable boy who couldn't play chess, who had blundered away piece after piece, who had just made the most ridiculous move anyone had ever seen, had been playing a game so far beyond their understanding that they hadn't even recognized what they were witnessing. And King Aldric, the Undefeated, the greatest chess mind in 7 kingdoms, was about to realize that he had walked directly into the most elegant trap ever constructed. But the revelation of exactly what Elias had done would shock everyone in that room to their very core. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. King Aldric sat frozen, his hand hovering over his queen, his eyes locked on the chessboard with an expression of growing horror. The confident king who had been mapping out his victory just moments before now looked like a man staring into an abyss. "Your Majesty," Lord Chancellor Blackwood repeated, his voice carrying a note of genuine concern. "The final move?" But King Aldric couldn't move, because he had just seen it. Hidden 17 moves deep in the position, camouflaged by what looked like complete incompetence, was a trap so sophisticated that it defied belief. Every piece Elias had blundered away wasn't lost. It was sacrificed. Every terrible move wasn't a mistake. It was bait. And King Aldric had taken every piece of that bait. The king's breathing became shallow. His face, which had been flushed with triumph moments before, was now pale as parchment, because he was beginning to understand that he hadn't been playing against an incompetent stable boy. He had been playing against a master. "I need..." King Aldric's voice cracked. "I need a moment to consider my options." "Options?" The court exchanged confused glances. What options? The mate in 4 was clear to everyone. All the king had to do was move his queen, and the game would be over. But that's exactly what King Aldric couldn't do. Because if he moved his queen to deliver checkmate, Elias's remaining pieces, the ones everyone had dismissed as worthless, would spring to life in a counterattack so devastating that the king would be mated first. It was impossible. It was brilliant. It was the kind of chess combination that grandmasters would study for generations. And it had been set up by someone everyone thought was an idiot. Duke Mortimer leaned forward, squinting at the board. "Your Majesty, forgive me, but the position seems quite clear. Surely you can simply..." "Don't," King Aldric snapped, his composure finally cracking completely. "Don't tell me what I can simply do." The outburst shocked everyone. King Aldric never raised his voice. He never showed emotion. He certainly never snapped at his own nobles during a public event. But then he did something even more shocking. He started calculating out loud. "If I move here," he muttered, pointing at his queen, "then he plays here, and then, no, that doesn't work. What if I go here instead? No, even worse. Maybe if I..." This wasn't the measured analysis of a confident master. This was the frantic scrambling of someone who had just realized he was drowning. Lady Evangeline whispered to her companion, "Something's wrong. He looks terrified." And she was right. For the first time in his life, King Aldric the Undefeated was experiencing something he had never felt before. the genuine possibility of losing. But it was worse than that. He wasn't just losing, he was being outplayed by someone he had dismissed as beneath his notice. Every assumption he had made, every judgment he had passed, every moment of superiority he had felt was crumbling before his eyes. Elias, meanwhile, sat perfectly still. The panic was gone. The apparent confusion was gone. In its place was something the court had never seen from him before: absolute calm. "Take your time, Your Majesty," he said quietly. "Chess is a game that rewards careful thought." There was something different about his voice now. The stammering peasant was gone. In his place spoke someone with a quiet confidence of true expertise. A few of the sharper observers in the court began to notice other changes. Elias's posture was straighter. His hands were steady. His eyes, when they looked at the board, showed the calculating gaze of someone who saw patterns and possibilities that others missed. How long has he been pretending? Lady Cordelia whispered to herself. Because that's what it had been, wasn't it? A performance. The fumbling, the terrible moves, the apparent confusion, all of it had been an act designed to make King Aldric overconfident and careless. Lord Chancellor Blackwood, who had been observing royal chess games for 30 years, began to see the position with new eyes. What had looked like random blundering now revealed itself as precise maneuvering. Each mistake had served a purpose, drawing the king's pieces to specific squares, creating weaknesses in his position, setting up this moment. "Magnificent," he breathed, and several nobles turned to stare at him. "What's magnificent?" Duke Mortimer demanded. "The trap," Blackwood replied, his voice filled with something approaching. "Look at the board. Really look at it. Every piece Elias has left is perfectly placed. Every piece the king has is overextended, committed to an attack that can't succeed." The realization spread through the court like wildfire. Whispers turned to urgent conversations. Pointing fingers traced lines of attack and defense. Eyes that had dismissed Elias as a joke now studied him with growing respect and fear. King Aldric heard it all. The changing tone, the shifting allegiances, the growing understanding that he had been completely, utterly, brilliantly outmaneuvered. And in that moment, he made a choice that would haunt him forever. Instead of accepting his fate with grace, instead of acknowledging the brilliance of his opponent, King Aldric decided to cheat. "Guards," he shouted suddenly. "Arrest this man." The throne room erupted in chaos. But what King Aldric didn't realize was that his desperate attempt to avoid defeat would only make his eventual downfall even more spectacular. The guards hesitated. In all their years of service, they had never seen King Aldric like this. Frantic, desperate, calling for arrests in the middle of a chess game, he had initiated himself. "Your Majesty," Captain Gareth said carefully, "on what ground should we arrest him?" "Cheating." King Aldric sputtered. "He must be cheating. Nobody plays that badly." And then suddenly. But he couldn't finish the sentence. Because everyone in the room could see the chessboard. They could see that no pieces had been moved illegally. No rules had been broken. Nothing had happened except brilliant, devastating, legitimate chess. "With respect, Your Majesty," Lord Chancellor Blackwood said slowly, "I've been watching every move. There has been no cheating." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. For 30 years, Blackwood had been King Aldric's most loyal advisor. He had never contradicted the king in public. He had never questioned a royal decision. But now, faced with this obvious injustice, he couldn't stay silent. Other voices began to join in. "The game has been fair," admitted Duke Mortimer, though he looked pained to say it. "Every move was made in full view of the court," added Lady Evangeline. Even some of the guards were nodding in agreement. They had eyes. They could see what was happening. King Aldric's face turned red with rage and embarrassment. "You're all against me. This is treason." But his accusations only made things worse. Because now the court wasn't just watching a chess game anymore. They were watching their king have a complete breakdown in front of hundreds of witnesses. And Elias? He sat calmly through it all, watching the chaos unfold with the same patient expression his father had once worn when observing the tantrums of spoiled children. "Perhaps," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the shouting, "we should simply finish the game." The simple suggestion silenced everyone. Because that's all it was, wasn't it? A game? A game that King Aldric had challenged Elias to play. A game with rules that both sides had agreed to follow. A game that was still in progress. Captain Gareth cleared his throat. Your Majesty, if I may, the young man accepted your challenge legally. The wager was witnessed by everyone present. Unless actual cheating has occurred, he didn't need to finish. The implication was clear. Honor demanded that the game continue. King Aldric looked around the throne room with wild eyes, searching for support that was no longer there. These same nobles who had laughed at Elias just minutes before were now looking at their king with expressions ranging from confusion to disappointment to outright disgust, because they were beginning to see King Aldric for what he really was. Not a brilliant strategist who never lost because of his superior intellect, but a bully who had never faced real opposition because he crushed anyone who dared to challenge him before they could prove their worth. Lady Cordelia, who had been one of the king's most devoted admirers, whispered to her companion, "How many others has he destroyed? How many brilliant minds has he silenced before they could shine?" It was a question that would haunt the court for years to come. The tension in the room had completely shifted. What had started as entertainment, watching a peasant get humiliated, had become something else entirely. A reckoning. A moment when everyone present had to choose what they truly believed in. Justice or power. Truth or convenience. Honor or fear. Duke Mortimer, a man who had built his entire career on reading political winds, made his choice. Your Majesty, he said formally, I believe the game should continue. The kingdom's honor depends on it. One by one, other nobles began to nod in agreement. Not because they suddenly loved Elias, most of them still looked down on him as a peasant, but because they understood that some things were more important than social status. King Aldric found himself completely alone, surrounded by hundreds of people, but utterly isolated by his own actions. Fine, he snarled, turning back to the chessboard. Fine, I'll finish this farce. And when I mate you in 4 moves, just as I promised, perhaps you'll all remember who your king is. But as he reached for his queen to deliver the checkmate he had been so confident about, something terrible happened. He couldn't move. Not because the guards stopped him. Not because anyone interfered. He couldn't move because he had finally fully understood the position. There's no mate in 4. There's no mate in 40. There's no mate at all. In fact, if he moved his queen anywhere at all, Elias would checkmate him in 3 moves. The trap wasn't just elegant. It wasn't just sophisticated. It was perfect. And everyone in the room was about to watch the undefeated king discover that he had been defeated 10 moves ago. He just hadn't realized it yet. The real game had never been about the pieces on the board. It had been about pride, arrogance, and the danger of underestimating your opponent. And Elias had won that game before it even started. But the moment when King Aldric would have to face this truth in front of his entire court, with his crown on the line, was about to become the most stunning reversal in the kingdom's history. In the suffocating silence of the throne room, one person was thinking faster than everyone else. Master Aldwin, the castle's chief librarian, was a man most people overlooked. Thin, elderly, with ink-stained fingers and clothes that always smelled of old parchment. He rarely spoke at court functions, preferring the company of books to the games of politics. But Master Aldwin had spent 40 years studying chess literature. He had cataloged every game in the royal library. He had analyzed the strategies of grandmasters from across the known world. And right now, he was staring at the chessboard with the expression of a man witnessing a miracle, because he was beginning to understand something that would change everything. This wasn't just a good trap. This wasn't even just a brilliant trap. This was the Phantom Gambit. Master Aldwin's hands began to tremble as the realization hit him. He pulled out a small leather notebook from his robes, the same notebook where he recorded remarkable chess positions for future study. His fingers flew across the pages, checking and double-checking what he was seeing. The Phantom Gambit was a chess combination so legendary that most masters believed it was purely theoretical. A mythical strategy that existed only in ancient texts, too complex and risky to ever execute in a real game. The strategy required a player to deliberately sacrifice almost their entire army while making it look like incompetence rather than brilliance. Every move had to appear terrible while actually setting up a trap 17 moves deep. The psychological warfare had to be perfect. Your opponent had to be so convinced of their superiority that they would walk blindly into the snare. Only one person in recorded history had ever successfully executed the Phantom Gambit, Magnus the Wise, and he had done it only once, in a private game whose records had been sealed and hidden away in the deepest vaults of the royal library. Master Aldwin looked up from his notebook, his eyes wide with shock and awe. He stared at Elias with new understanding. This young man hadn't just learned chess from his father. He had learned the most sophisticated chess strategy ever devised. A strategy so advanced that scholars still debated whether it was even possible to execute in a real game against a master-level opponent. And he had just pulled it off against the greatest chess player in 7 kingdoms. Impossible, Master Aldwin whispered to himself. But Lady Cordelia, standing near him, caught the word. What's impossible, Master Aldwin? The old librarian looked at her with eyes that seemed to be seeing ghosts. That position, he said, pointing at the chessboard with a shaking finger. I've seen it before. Where? In Magnus the Wise's private papers. A game he played 30 years ago. The only recorded example of a strategy called the Phantom Gambit. Word spread through the court like wildfire. Nobles who had never cared about chess suddenly pressed closer to hear what Master Aldwin was saying. What's a Phantom Gambit? Duke Mortimer demanded. Master Aldwin took a shaky breath. It's the ultimate chess trap. You sacrifice everything to make your opponent overconfident. You play so badly that they stop taking you seriously. And then, when they commit to their final attack, he gestured at the board. They discover they've been mated for the last 10 moves. They just didn't know it. The silence in the throne room became absolute. Everyone turned to look at the chessboard with new eyes. What had seemed like a hopeless position for Elias suddenly revealed itself as something else entirely. A masterpiece. Every terrible move had been calculated. Every blunder had been bait. Every moment of apparent weakness had been designed to draw King Aldric deeper into the trap. And it had worked perfectly. Lord Chancellor Blackwood, who had been studying the position intently, suddenly gasped. Dear God, he breathed. He's right. Look at the knight's position. And the bishop's diagonal. And the way the pawns control those squares. Other chess players in the court began to see it too. The geometric perfection of the trap. The way every piece worked together in perfect harmony. The mathematical beauty of a plan that had unfolded exactly as designed. This is art, whispered Sir Marcus, the court's former chess champion. This isn't just winning. This is poetry. And through it all, Elias sat quietly, watching the recognition dawn on face after face. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile triumphantly. He simply waited with the patience of someone who had known this moment would come from the very first move. King Aldric, meanwhile, was still frozen at the board, his hand hovering over his queen. He could hear the whispers. He could feel the shift in the room's energy. He could sense his absolute authority crumbling with every passing second. But he still hadn't made his move, because he had finally fully understood what Master Aldwin was trying to tell everyone. He wasn't just losing a chess game. He was losing to the greatest strategic mind his kingdom had ever produced. A mind he had dismissed as worthless. A mind he had mocked and humiliated. A mind that had just taught him the most expensive lesson of his life. But the moment when he would have to publicly acknowledge his defeat, when the undefeated would have to surrender his crown to a stable boy, was about to become the most shocking moment in the kingdom's 1,000-year history. Minutes passed like hours. King Aldric's hand remained frozen over his queen, trembling slightly as the full weight of his situation pressed down on him. The whispers in the court had died away, replaced by a tension so thick you could cut it with a sword. Everyone was waiting for the same thing, the moment when the undefeated would have to admit he had been defeated. But something else was happening in that silence, something that would change the kingdom forever. The nobles, guards, and servants weren't just watching a chess game anymore. They were watching their king's true character reveal itself under pressure. And what they saw was ugly. Here was a man who had built his entire identity on never losing, faced with the possibility of loss. Instead of grace, he showed desperation. Instead of honor, he had tried to cheat. Instead of accepting a brilliant opponent's victory, he was paralyzed by his own pride. Lady Evangeline, who had spent years trying to win the king's favor, found herself thinking thoughts that would have been treason just an hour earlier. What kind of ruler, she whispered to herself, cannot bear to lose even once? Others were having similar realizations. Duke Mortimer remembered all the times King Aldric had crushed potential rivals not through superior skill, but by ensuring they never got a fair chance to compete. How many brilliant minds had been silenced? How many innovations had been stopped? How many people had been destroyed simply for daring to challenge the king's superiority? Captain Gareth thought about the soldiers who had been executed for cowardice after questioning the king's military strategies. Strategies that, in hindsight, had cost thousands of unnecessary lives because King Aldric refused to admit when he was wrong. Master Alwyn looked at his library and thought about all the books that had been banned, all the research that had been forbidden, simply because it might make someone smarter than the king wanted them to be. The truth was surfacing, all right? But it wasn't just the truth about the chess game. It was the truth about everything. And Elias seemed to understand this. When he finally spoke, breaking the suffocating silence, his words were carefully chosen. "Your Majesty," he said gently, "would you like me to show you the line of play? I understand the position can be difficult to see." The offer was made with such genuine kindness that it took everyone by surprise. Here was the victor offering to help his opponent understand his defeat. Not gloating, not humiliating, actually trying to help. The contrast with King Aldric's earlier behavior couldn't have been more stark. "I don't need your help," the king snarled, but his voice cracked on the words. "Of course not, Your Majesty. I simply thought—" Elias paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "My father always said that the most beautiful thing about chess wasn't winning or losing. It was the moment when both players could appreciate the geometry of the game together." Magnus again. The name hit the court like a physical blow, reminding everyone of what they had lost when King Aldric had destroyed the greatest mind their kingdom had ever produced. Sir Marcus, the former court chess champion, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, if I may, perhaps we could examine the position together?" As scholars of the game, it was a lifeline, a way for the king to save face while acknowledging reality. He could frame his defeat as a learning experience rather than a humiliation. But King Aldric's pride was too great, his fear too overwhelming. "I said I don't need help," he shouted, and in his rage, he finally moved. He pushed his queen forward to deliver the checkmate he had promised 17 moves earlier. The piece clicked against the marble square with a sound like a funeral bell. And immediately, everyone who understood chess gasped in horror. Because King Aldric had just walked directly into the trap's jaws. Elias responded instantly, moving a piece that most people hadn't even noticed was important. A quiet knight move that suddenly activated every dormant thread on the board. "Check," Elias said softly. King Aldric's eyes went wide as he saw what had happened. His king was under attack, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that every escape square was controlled. Every defensive piece was pinned. Every possible response led to an even worse position. He was being checkmated in a way so elegant, so precisely calculated, that would be studied by chess masters for centuries. Master Alwyn was frantically scribbling in his notebook, trying to record every detail of what he was witnessing. "Magnificent," he kept whispering. "Absolutely magnificent." But for King Aldric, there was nothing magnificent about it. He was trapped. Completely, utterly, brilliantly trapped. And in that moment, facing the undeniable reality of his defeat, something inside him broke. Not his strategic mind, though that had already been shattered. Not his confidence, though that was long gone. Not even his pride, though that lay in ruins around him. What broke was his grip on power itself. Because everyone in that room could see what he had become. And more importantly, they could see what Elias represented. Intelligence over arrogance. Grace over brutality. True strength over the illusion of dominance. The revolution hadn't started with swords or armies. It had started with a chess move. And it was about to change everything. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. "Checkmate." Elias said it so quietly that some people in the back of the throne room weren't sure they had heard correctly. But those closest to the board knew. They could see it with perfect clarity. King Aldric's king was trapped. Completely, irrevocably, brilliantly trapped. There was no escape. No clever countermove. No last-minute salvation. The undefeated had been defeated. For a moment that stretched into eternity, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The magnitude of what had just happened was so enormous that it seemed to break everyone's ability to process reality. King Aldric stared at the board with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. Because what words could possibly encompass this moment? In the span of a single chess game, everything had changed. The king who had never lost had lost. The peasant who couldn't play chess had executed the most sophisticated strategy in the game's history. The natural order of the kingdom had been turned completely upside down, and it had all happened in front of hundreds of witnesses. Master Aldwin broke the silence first, his voice filled with awe. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the court, "you have just witnessed the greatest chess game ever played." The words seemed to release everyone from their paralysis. Whispers exploded into conversations. Pointing fingers traced the lines of the brilliant checkmate. Nobles who had never cared about chess suddenly found themselves desperate to understand what they had seen. But all eyes eventually turned to the two men at the center of it all. King Aldric, still frozen in shock and denial, and Elias, sitting calmly with the quiet dignity of someone who had just changed history. "The wager," Lord Chancellor Blackwood said slowly, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. The terms were clear. If Elias won, he couldn't finish the sentence. The implications were too staggering. Because King Aldric had bet everything. His crown, his kingdom, his power, his legacy. All of it now belonged to a 22-year-old stable boy. "No," King Aldric whispered, finally finding his voice. "No, this isn't possible. There must be some mistake. Some trick I'm not seeing." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The position was clear. The checkmate was undeniable. The game was over. Elias stood up slowly, his worn clothes somehow looking more dignified than the king's royal robes. When he spoke, his voice was steady and strong. "Your Majesty," he said formally, "you fought brilliantly. The Phantom Gambit only works against a truly exceptional opponent. Anyone lesser would have seen through the deception. Even in victory, he was trying to preserve the king's dignity, trying to soften the blow of defeat. But King Aldric was beyond such courtesy. "I am still your king," he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "One game doesn't change that. One lucky game doesn't make you fit to rule." The outburst horrified everyone present. This wasn't the behavior of a noble ruler accepting defeat with grace. This was the tantrum of a spoiled child who couldn't bear to lose his toys. "A wager made before witnesses," Captain Gareth said firmly, "is a wager that must be honored. That is the law of the kingdom. I am the law." King Aldric shrieked. And in that moment, everyone in the throne room understood something fundamental about power. It wasn't the crown that made someone a king. It wasn't the throne or the castle or the armies. It was the respect and loyalty of the people. And King Aldric had just lost all of that. Duke Mortimer, who had served the crown faithfully for 30 years, took a step forward. "Your former Majesty," he said, and the title change sent shockwaves through the room. "The game is over. Honor your word." One by one, other nobles began to nod in agreement, not because they particularly wanted Elias as their new king, but because they understood that some principles were more important than convenience. Honor was more important than loyalty to a cheater. Truth was more important than maintaining the status quo. Justice was more important than fear. Lady Evangeline, surprising everyone including herself, began to applaud. "Long live King Elias," she called out. The words were taken up by others. First a few voices, then dozens, then hundreds. "Long live King Elias. Long live the new king. Long live Magnus' son." The revolution was complete. Not through violence or bloodshed, but through the simple recognition that true leadership came from character, not birthright. King Aldric looked around the throne room with wild, desperate eyes. These same people who had bowed to him just an hour earlier were now cheering for his replacement. And Elias? He stood quietly in the center of it all, looking not triumphant but thoughtful. The weight of what had just happened was clearly settling on his shoulders. He had won more than a chess game. He had won a kingdom. But as the cheers grew louder and the reality of his new position became clear, one question remained. What would he do with the power he had just gained? The answer would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone in the realm. The first test of Elias's reign came 30 seconds after he won it. As the cheers of "Long live King Elias" echoed through the throne room, the former King Aldric did something that would define everything that followed. He lunged for his sword. In his madness and desperation, he drew the royal blade and charged toward Elias with a scream of pure rage. "If I cannot rule, then no one shall." It was the final, pathetic act of a man who had lost everything, including his sanity. But before Aldric could take 3 steps, Captain Gareth and 2 other guards intercepted him. The former king found himself on the marble floor, disarmed and pinned, screaming incoherently about treason and conspiracy. The court watched in stunned horror. This was their former ruler? This raving, defeated man who would try to murder his successor rather than accept defeat with dignity? And how did Elias respond to this assassination attempt? He knelt down beside the man who had just tried to kill him. "Your Majesty," he said gently, using the former king's title even though it no longer applied. "You're in pain. I understand. Let me help you." The simple act of compassion in the face of attempted murder sent a shockwave through everyone present. Here was a leader who met violence with mercy, hatred with understanding. "Get away from me," Aldric snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "I don't want your pity." "It's not pity," Elias replied calmly. "It's respect. You were a great chess player, Your Majesty. That game we just played, it only worked because you are truly exceptional. A lesser opponent would never have fallen for the Phantom Gambit. Even in his victory, even after an assassination attempt, Elias was trying to preserve what remained of his predecessor's dignity. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Lord Chancellor Blackwood stepped forward, his face grave. Your Majesty," he said, addressing Elias with a title that still sounded surreal. "What are your orders regarding the former king?" It was the first official decision of the new reign, and everyone knew it would set the tone for everything that followed. Would a new king execute his predecessor? Imprison him? Banish him? The precedent in such situations was usually swift and violent justice. Elias stood slowly, looking down at the broken man who had ruled the kingdom for 23 years. "He will be given comfortable quarters in the East Wing," Elias said finally, "with access to books, chess sets, and whatever he needs for his studies. He is free to leave the kingdom if he chooses, with a generous pension to ensure his comfort." The gasps from the court were audible. "Your Majesty," Duke Mortimer said carefully, "is that wise?" "He did just attempt to. He attempted to strike out in pain and fear," Elias interrupted gently. "Have any of us never done something foolish when we were hurt? He is no longer a threat to anyone except himself." Lady Evangeline found herself wiping away tears. In 5 minutes, she had watched their old king try to commit murder, and their new king respond with forgiveness and mercy. But Elias continued, his voice taking on a note of authority that surprised everyone. "Let it be known throughout the kingdom that such mercy is earned through acknowledgement of wrong, not granted as weakness. Those who would threaten the peace of our realm will find justice swift and certain." The combination of compassion and strength in those words marked the birth of a new kind of leadership. Captain Gareth nodded respectfully. "It shall be done, Your Majesty." But the immediate crisis was just the beginning. As word the incredible chess game and its outcomes spread beyond the throne room, reactions began pouring in from every corner of the kingdom. The first to arrive were the castle servants, the people who had worked alongside Elias in the stables and kitchens. They couldn't believe their former colleague was now their king. Some wept with joy. Others stood in shocked silence. "Elias," whispered Sarah, a kitchen maid who had often shared her bread with him. "Is it really you?" "It's still me," he assured her with a gentle smile. "Though I suspect I'll need better clothes for court functions." The humanity in that simple joke did something remarkable. It broke the last barriers of disbelief and replaced them with something far more powerful: hope. Here was a king who had lived as they lived, who understood hunger and hardship and the daily struggles of common people, who had risen not through birthright or conquest, but through intelligence, patience, and moral courage. But not everyone was celebrating. Reports began filtering in from across the kingdom. Some nobles were already fleeing to neighboring realms, taking their wealth with them. Others were barricading themselves in their castles, refusing to acknowledge the new king's authority. Most troubling of all, 3 dukes from the northern provinces had sent a joint message. They would not bow to a peasant usurper and were raising armies to restore proper order. The kingdom was on the brink of civil war. And Elias, who had won his crown through brilliance at a chessboard, was about to learn that ruling a kingdom required an entirely different kind of strategy. But as he stood in the throne room, surrounded by supporters and enemies alike, one thing was becoming clear. The young man who had executed the perfect chess trap was about to prove that his greatest game was just beginning. 3 days after the chess game that changed everything, King Elias faced his first war council. The great strategy room was filled with tension as thick as smoke. Maps covered every surface, marked with red flags showing where rebel forces were gathering. Reports poured in hourly, each one more troubling than the last. Duke Ravencrest had declared himself regent of the true crown and was marching south with 5,000 men. Duke Blackthorn had allied with neighboring kingdom of Mordavia, promising them rich borderlands in exchange for military support. Duke Grimwald had seized the northern treasury and was using the gold to hire mercenary companies. Together, they commanded nearly 15,000 troops against Elias's royal army of 8,000. The mathematics of war looked grim. "Your Majesty," General Hawthorne said grimly, "I must be honest. Our forces are outnumbered nearly 2-1. Many of our soldiers are uncertain about fighting for, forgive me, a former stable boy." It was the brutal truth everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say. Captain Gareth disagreed. "The men I've spoken to are inspired by His Majesty's story. They believe they're fighting for something greater than just another noble's ambition. Inspiration doesn't stop arrows," Duke Mortimer pointed out. "We need strategy." All eyes turned to Elias, who had been studying the maps in silence. For 3 days, he had thrown himself into learning everything about military tactics, kingdom finances, and political alliances. The same intensity he had once applied to chess was now focused on the art of war. "Tell me," he said finally, "what do these 3 dukes have in common besides their rebellion?" The question caught everyone off guard. "They're all from the north?" Lady Evangeline suggested. "They're all wealthy?" offered Lord Blackwood. "They all have something to hide," Elias said quietly. The room fell silent. "Captain Gareth, you've served in this castle for 15 years. You've seen things, heard things. What secrets do these 3 dukes share?" Captain Gareth shifted uncomfortably. "Your Majesty, there are rumors about their involvement in certain now activities during the famine 5 years ago." "What kind of activities?" "They were supposed to distribute grain to the starving provinces. Instead, they sold it to foreign merchants for profit. Thousands died while they grew rich." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Even those who had suspected corruption hadn't known the full extent of it. "And the former king knew about this?" Elias asked. King Aldric looked the other way. "As long as they remained loyal to him personally." Elias nodded slowly. Here was the key to everything. These weren't principled nobles defending tradition against change. They were criminals terrified that a new king might actually hold them accountable for their crimes. "Master Aldwin," Elias called to the librarian, who had become an unofficial advisor. "I need you to gather every document related to the grain distribution during the famine. Every receipt, every order, every piece of correspondence. Your Majesty, those records were sealed by royal decree. I'm unsealing them. All of them." The implications hit the room like a thunderbolt. If those documents became public, it wouldn't just destroy the 3 rebel dukes. It would expose a network of corruption that reached into every corner of the kingdom. "Brilliant," whispered Lord Blackwood. "You're not just fighting a military war. You're fighting a war of legitimacy." General Hawthorne frowned. "But Your Majesty, even if we prove their crimes, they still have 15,000 soldiers." "Do they?" Elias asked with a slight smile that reminded everyone of the chess game. "Captain Gareth, send heralds to every village, every town, every crossroads in the kingdom. Let them proclaim the truth about the famine. Let the people know exactly who profited from their suffering. And then we offer amnesty to any soldier who abandons these criminals and returns to serve the crown. Full pardons, back pay, and bonuses for their families." The strategy was elegantly simple. Instead of fighting the armies, Elias was planning to dissolve them. Lady Evangeline shook her head in amazement. "You're going to turn their own men against them. I'm going to give their men a choice between serving murderers and serving justice." But there was more. "Duke Mortimer, I want you to draft a new law. Anyone who profited from the people's suffering during times of crisis will make full restitution. Their stolen wealth will be returned to the families of their victims." That's revolutionary, Your Majesty." "Good. Sometimes revolution is exactly what's needed." Within hours, the first heralds were riding out with copies of the famine documents and proclamations of the new king's amnesty offer. By sunset, the first deserters were arriving at royal outposts, abandoning the rebel armies to seek forgiveness from their new king. But Duke Ravencrest wasn't finished. When word reached him of Elias's strategy, He sent a message that chilled everyone who read it. If that peasant boy thinks he can destroy us with pieces of paper, he's even more naive than I thought. We have something better than documents. We have the former King Aldric himself. And tomorrow we will restore him to his rightful throne, even if we have to burn the entire kingdom to do it. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Somehow, the rebel dukes had kidnapped the former king from his comfortable exile and were using him as a puppet to legitimize their rebellion. The merciful decision to spare Aldric's life had just become a weapon pointed at the heart of Elias's reign. But as the young king stared at that threatening message, something flickered in his eyes. The same calculating look he had worn during the chess game. Because Elias was beginning to realize that his enemies had just made the same mistake King Aldric had made at the chessboard. They had underestimated him. And they were about to learn that the greatest victories don't always come from the strongest armies. What Elias did next will be remembered as the most brilliant political maneuver in the kingdom's history. Instead of mobilizing his armies to march against the rebels, he did something completely unexpected. He sent them an invitation. To Duke Ravencrest, Duke Blackthorn, and Duke Grimwald, the message read, and to his former majesty King Aldric, whom I understand is traveling in your company. You are cordially invited to meet me at the crossroads of 4 kingdoms at dawn tomorrow. Come alone, or with whatever escort you deem necessary. I wish to discuss terms. The rebel dukes were baffled. What kind of king invites his enemies to negotiate when he's in a position of apparent weakness? Duke Ravencrest laughed when he read it. The boy's lost his nerve already. He wants to surrender before we even have to fight. Duke Blackthorn was more suspicious. It could be a trap. What trap? Grimwald scoffed. He has 8,000 men. We have 15,000. If he wants to meet us in the open field, we'll crush him and end this farce once and for all. They decided to attend the meeting, but with their full armies positioned for battle. What they found at the crossroads of 4 kingdoms the next morning changed everything. Elias was there as promised. But he wasn't alone. Standing with him were representatives from every village, every town, every province in the kingdom. Farmers whose families had starved during the famine. Merchants who had been ruined by the Duke's corruption. Soldiers who had deserted the rebel armies after learning the truth. Thousands of people. The true power of the kingdom. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The most shocking part was that former King Aldric was standing beside Elias, free and unharmed. Surprised to see me, Aldric called out to his supposed rescuers. Did you really think I wouldn't figure out that you were using me as a puppet? The truth hit the rebel dukes like a thunderbolt. Their kidnapping of the former king had been a setup. Aldric had gone with them willingly, not to legitimize their rebellion, but to spy on them for Elias. You see, Elias addressed the assembled crowd, his voice carrying across the field. His former majesty and I have had several long conversations over the past few days, and we've reached an understanding. Aldric stepped forward, his voice stronger than it had been since his defeat. I was a flawed king. I let pride and fear drive me to make terrible decisions. I allowed corruption to flourish because it served my vanity. I nearly destroyed the kingdom I was sworn to protect. The admission sent shockwaves through both armies. But, Aldric continued, I have seen what true leadership looks like. And I have seen what happens when good men choose to serve justice instead of their own interests. He turned to face the rebel dukes, his eyes blazing with the authority that reminded everyone why he had once been called the Undefeated. Duke Ravencrest, Duke Blackthorn, Duke Grimwald, you are traitors not just to the crown, but to the people you were sworn to protect. You profited from their suffering. You turned their tragedy into your treasure. And now you would drag this kingdom into civil war, rather than face justice for your crimes. The rebel dukes were speechless. Their legitimacy, their justification, their very reason for rebellion had just been stripped away by the man they thought was their greatest asset. But Elias wasn't finished. I want every soldier in both armies to listen carefully, he called out. Today you have a choice. You can fight for men who stole food from starving children. Or you can stand with a kingdom that promises justice, prosperity, and hope for everyone. He gestured to the crowd of common people surrounding him. These are your families, your neighbors, your friends. Look at their faces. See what the Duke's greed has cost them. And then decide who truly deserves your loyalty. The effect was immediate and devastating. Soldiers began laying down their weapons. First a few, then dozens, then entire companies. They walked across the field to join Elias's forces, many of them weeping as they embraced family members they hadn't seen in months. Within an hour, the rebel army had shrunk from 15,000 to less than 3,000, mostly mercenaries who fought only for gold. Duke Ravencrest, seeing his forces melting away, made one last desperate play. "You fools!" he screamed at his fleeing soldiers. "He's just a stable boy, a peasant. How can you choose him over your rightful lords?" And that's when something beautiful happened. A grizzled sergeant who had served for 20 years turned back to face the Duke. "Because, my lord," he said with quiet dignity, "he's the only one of you who's ever mucked out a stable. He knows what real work looks like. And he's the only one who's ever cared whether we live or die." The transformation was complete. The power hadn't just shifted from the old king to the new one. It had shifted from the aristocracy to the people themselves. They had seen what leadership could look like when it served justice instead of ego, when it protected the weak instead of exploiting them. The rebel dukes, facing the ruins of their rebellion, finally understood what they were truly up against. Not just a clever young king who was good at chess, but the will of an entire kingdom that had finally found someone worthy of their loyalty. The revolution was over. The real work of building a better kingdom was about to begin. 1 year later, the kingdom of Aldric was unrecognizable. Where once stood a realm built on fear and oppression, there now flourished something unprecedented in the known world, a kingdom that actually served its people. The changes began immediately after the Crossroads victory. The three rebel dukes, stripped of their titles and lands, were given a choice that shocked everyone: exile with enough gold to live comfortably abroad, or remain in the kingdom as common citizens and work to repair the damage they had caused. Duke Ravencrest chose exile, fleeing to distant shores with his shame. But Duke Blackthorn and Duke Grimwald, perhaps inspired by their former king's example of redemption, chose to stay. They were now working in the reconstruction of the villages they had once impoverished, their vast wealth redistributed to the families of famine victims. Mercy, Elias had told his advisors when they questioned these lenient sentences, is not weakness when it comes with justice. These men will do more good rebuilding what they destroyed than they would rotting in dungeons. The royal castle itself had been transformed. The grand throne room where that legendary chess game had taken place was now open to all citizens every morning. Any person, regardless of birth or status, could bring their concerns directly to the king. And Elias listened to them all. Sarah, the kitchen maid who had once shared bread with a stable boy, now served as the royal coordinator of common affairs, a position that had never existed before but proved essential for a king who never forgot where he came from. "Your Majesty," she reported during one morning session, "the harvest in the western provinces is expected to be exceptional this year. The new irrigation systems are working perfectly." Those irrigation systems were just one example of the revolution in governance. Instead of gold being hoarded in royal treasuries or spent on lavish parties, it was invested in infrastructure that helped everyone. Roads that connected remote villages to markets. Schools that taught not just nobles' children, but any child who wanted to learn. Hospitals staffed with healers who served based on need, not ability to pay. Master Aldwin, now the Royal Chancellor of Education, had established libraries in every major town. Knowledge, he often said, quoting something Elias had told him, is too valuable to be locked away. It grows when it's shared. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the kingdom's relationship with neighbors. Where King Aldric had ruled through intimidation and military threats, King Elias governed through alliance and mutual benefit. The kingdom of Mordavia, which had once been preparing to invade, was now Valdris's closest trading partner. Their shared prosperity made war not just unnecessary, but economically destructive for both realms. It turns out, Captain Gareth observed during a council meeting, that people prefer to buy and sell rather than fight and die. The military itself had been restructured. Instead of existing solely to project royal power, the army now served as both defenders and builders. Soldiers spent as much time constructing bridges and aiding disaster relief as they did training for combat. General Hawthorne, initially skeptical of these changes, had become one of their strongest advocates. "I've been a soldier for 30 years, he told visiting dignitaries, "and I've never been prouder of my service than I am now." Even former King Aldric had found his place in this new world order. Rather than living in comfortable exile as originally planned, he had asked to serve as the royal strategic advisor. His deep knowledge of governance and hard-earned wisdom about the costs of pride made him an invaluable counselor. "I spent 23 years learning how to be a king," He told Elias during one of their regular chess games, "Friendly matches now, with no crowns at stake. But you've taught me what it means to be a leader." The relationship between the two men had become one of the kingdom's greatest symbols of hope. If a proud king could learn humility and a stable boy could master statecraft, then any conflict could be resolved through understanding rather than violence. But the most profound change was in the people themselves. Citizens who had once lived in fear of their government now participated in it. Town councils made local decisions. Trade guilds negotiated fair wages. Farmers cooperated on irrigation projects that benefited entire regions. The kingdom had learned that true strength came not from the absolute power of one ruler, but from the collective wisdom and effort of all its people working together. And at the center of it all was Elias, no longer the nervous young man who had trembled before a chessboard. He had grown into his role with the same patient intelligence that had won him the crown. He still spent time in the stables, still talked with servants and farmers, still remembered every lesson his father had taught him about the game of chess and the game of life. But now he was teaching those lessons to others. The royal chess set, the same golden pieces that had witnessed his legendary victory, sat in the great library where anyone could use it. And every evening, Elias could be found there, teaching the game to children from across the kingdom. Chess, he would tell them, is not about winning or losing. It's about thinking ahead, considering consequences, and understanding that every move matters. They were lessons about far more than just a board game. They were lessons about how to build a world worth living in. But the final lesson, the one that would echo through history long after the golden chess pieces had tarnished and the stories had become legends, was still to come. So what does this incredible story teach us? What can we learn from a stable boy who became a king through a single chess game? The answer might surprise you, because this story isn't really about chess at all. 5 years after that legendary game, Master Aldwin was compiling the official history of the kingdom's transformation. As he interviewed hundreds of people who had witnessed those incredible events, one question kept coming up. How did Elias know the Phantom Gambit would work? The answer came from an unexpected source, Elias himself. During one of their evening conversations, the king finally revealed the truth that would change how everyone understood that fateful day. "I almost didn't challenge King Aldric," he admitted to Master Aldwin. "I stood outside that throne room for an hour, terrified. I knew I could play chess well, but I also knew he was a genuine master." The Phantom Gambit had only worked once in recorded history, for my father, against an opponent who wasn't expecting it. Master Aldwin leaned forward, intrigued. "Then why did you go through with it?" Elias smiled, the same quiet smile that had puzzled the court during those dark middle moves of the game. "Because I realized something that changed everything. I wasn't just playing chess against King Aldric. I was playing chess against everything he represented. Arrogance, cruelty, the belief that some people matter more than others." He paused, choosing his words carefully. And when you're fighting for something bigger than yourself, when you're fighting for justice and truth and the possibility that things can be better, you find strength you didn't know you had. The real secret of the Phantom Gambit wasn't the chess moves at all. It was the courage to believe that intelligence could triumph over brute force, that patience could overcome aggression, that someone who had been dismissed and underestimated could rise up and change the world. "Every terrible move I made," Elias continued, "every piece I sacrificed, every moment when I looked defeated, it wasn't just strategy. It was faith. Faith that if I held on long enough, if I stayed true to the plan, if I never gave up hope, eventually the truth would win." And that's the lesson that echoes far beyond the walls of any castle or the boundaries of any kingdom. You see, we all face moments when we feel like Elias in that throne room. Moments when we're surrounded by people who have more power, more resources, more advantages than we do. Moments when the smart money says we should just give up, bow our heads, and accept that this is just how things are. But this story reminds us of something powerful. True strength isn't about the size of your army, or the gold in your treasury, or the crown on your head. True strength is about the courage to stand up for what's right, even when you're standing alone. True strength is about using your intelligence and creativity to find solutions that others can't see. True strength is about never forgetting where you came from or the people who depend on you. Most importantly, true strength is about understanding that the greatest victories aren't won through domination, but through lifting others up. Think about the people in your own life who have made the biggest difference. Were they the ones with the most power, the most money, the highest titles? Or were they the ones who saw potential in you when you couldn't see it in yourself? Who taught you something valuable? Who stood by you when things got tough? Who showed you that there was a better way forward? The Elias in your life might be a teacher who believes in you, a friend who challenges you to be better, a mentor who shows you possibilities you never imagined, a colleague who stands up for what's right even when it's difficult. Or maybe, just maybe, you're the Elias in someone else's story. Maybe you're the one who has the knowledge, the skills, the courage to make a difference. Maybe you're the one who can see the solution that others are missing. Maybe you're the one who can execute the perfect strategy to overcome what seems impossible. The question isn't whether you have a royal bloodline or a noble title or any of the external markers of power that the world tells us matter. The question is, do you have the courage to use whatever gifts you possess in service of something greater than yourself? Because that's what Elias really teaches us. That extraordinary change doesn't require extraordinary circumstances. It requires ordinary people willing to do extraordinary things. It requires the patience to plan 17 moves ahead, the wisdom to learn from the masters who came before you, the humility to serve others rather than just yourself, the courage to stand up to bullies, no matter how powerful they seem, and the faith to believe that intelligence, justice, and compassion will ultimately triumph over ignorance, oppression, and cruelty. So the next time you're facing your own King Aldric, whether it's a difficult boss, an unfair system, a personal challenge that seems insurmountable, or just the voice in your head that says you're not smart enough, strong enough, or good enough to make a difference, remember the stable boy who became a king. Remember that every expert was once a beginner. Every master was once a student. Every king was once someone who had to find the courage to make their first move. Your chessboard is waiting. Your moment is coming. And when it arrives, you'll be ready. Because now you know the secret of the Phantom Gambit. Sometimes the best way to win is to let your opponents underestimate you until it's too late for them to stop you from changing everything. What if I told you that 5 simple words change the course of an entire kingdom forever? You're about to witness one of the most shocking power reversals in history. A story so unbelievable that if it were fiction, you'd call it unrealistic. But this actually happened. Picture this, you're standing in the grand throne room of a medieval castle. The air is thick with tension. Hundreds of nobles, knights, and servants have gathered to witness what they believe will be nothing more than entertainment. The king sits on his golden throne, his crown catching the light from massive chandeliers above. He's laughing, actually laughing. But the person standing before him, they're trembling. Meet Elias, 22 years old, thin as a reed, clothes that have seen better days, much better days. His hands shake as he clutches a worn leather satchel. Everyone in that room sees the same thing, a nobody. A peasant who somehow managed to stumble into the presence of royalty. King Aldric leans forward, his massive frame dwarfing the ornate throne. Gold rings glint on every finger. His voice booms across the marble floors. I'll give you my crown if you can beat me. The entire court erupts in laughter. Nobles elbow each other, whispering jokes. Guards smirk behind their helmets. Even the servants can barely contain their amusement. You see, King Aldric wasn't just any king. He was known throughout the 7 kingdoms as the Undefeated. In 43 years of life, he had never lost. Not at war. Not at politics. Not at anything that mattered. His kingdom was the richest, his army the strongest, his treasury the fullest. And here stood Elias, a young man who looked like he hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. But here's what nobody in that room knew. Not the laughing nobles, not the sneering guards, not even the king himself. They were all about to witness something that will be talked about for generations. Elias wasn't just any peasant. You might be wondering, what could this trembling young man possibly possess that would threaten a king who had everything? What was in that worn leather satchel he clutched so desperately? The answer will blow your mind. But first, let me tell you how he got here. How a nobody from nowhere ended up standing before the most powerful man in the kingdom, about to change everything. 3 days earlier, Elias had been nothing. Less than nothing. He worked in the castle stables, mucking out stalls for copper coins that barely bought him bread. The other stable hands mocked him. The kitchen maids ignored him. Even the castle dogs seemed to look down on him. But Elias had a secret. Every night, after the castle fell quiet, he would sneak into the old tower library. a place so forgotten that dust layered the floor like snow. There, surrounded by ancient books and scrolls that hadn't been touched in decades, Elias would study. What was he studying? That's the question that haunted everyone who would later try to piece together this incredible story. Some say he was learning forbidden magic. Others whispered about ancient mathematical formulas. The truth? It was something far more powerful than either. You see, while King Aldric ruled through fear and gold, while his nobles schemed for favor and position, while his armies conquered through strength, Elias was mastering something they had all forgotten. Something that no crown could buy, no sword could defeat, no army could overcome. And now, standing in that throne room with hundreds of eyes mocking him, Elias was about to prove that true power doesn't always wear a crown. King Aldric's challenge echoed off the marble walls. "I'll give you my crown if you can beat me." The king expected Elias to stammer, to apologize, to back down like everyone else always did. After all, who would dare challenge the undefeated? But instead of cowering, something incredible happened. Elias straightened his shoulders. The trembling stopped. He looked directly into the king's eyes, something no peasant had ever dared to do, and spoke words that sent a chill through the entire room. "Your Majesty, I accept your challenge." The laughter died instantly. You could have heard a pin drop in that massive throne room. Nobles exchanged worried glances. Guards shifted nervously. The king's smile faltered for just a moment, the first crack in his armor of absolute confidence. Because in that instant, everyone realized something had just changed. This wasn't going to be the entertainment they expected. This was going to be something else entirely. But what happens next will shock you even more than what you've already heard. Because what King Aldric proposed as a challenge, what he was so certain he would win, was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible.